So the problem is you can't show up at any agency that supports homeless individuals or unhoused individuals and say that I'm homeless if you are not in the system as a homeless person. And being released from prison does not qualify you for that. And then we also worked on FAFSA simplification. And this all came out of the Unlock Higher Ed Coalition that we started just to really challenge access to higher education for currently and formerly incarcerated students. You didn't get where you were overnight, and upon your release, your transition is not going to happen overnight. So give yourself grace and space.
Hi, my name is Teresa Hodge, and welcome to Come Home Ready. This is season 2, and I'm so excited to talk to one of my good friends, Sarita Stibe. I've known Sarita for, I don't know, maybe like 7, 8?
8 years.
8 years. Mm-hmm. And when I met Sarita, her nickname was Pretty. So I want to introduce you guys to Pretty. See, that made you laugh because that's how people always referred to you. And for a long time, I didn't know your name. So tell us, how did you get the name Pretty?
Well, it was a nickname from like childhood. So when I was incarcerated, I went to prison at 19. So I still was very much a child. I have a big tattoo on my leg that says Pretty, which was the nickname. So that's what everybody called me while I was incarcerated. They called me Pretty.
Okay. See, I didn't know the whole backstory. I just knew everybody who knew you called you Pretty. Mm-hmm. So talk to us. You know, this episode is going to be viewed by people who are in prison, men and women. But I know a lot of times content and information for those of us who've gone to prison and as women, there's just not a lot out there. And all the content that comes in is for men, it feels like. The programming's for men. So can you tell us first a little bit about your story? Mm-hmm. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, but just, how did you find yourself at 19 in prison?
Yeah, so I think like most women, the path that leads you to prison is like trauma. So as a child, I was physically abused. I was sexually assaulted at 16. And even though like on the outside looking in, I came from a family. My mom was a judge. When I went to prison, my dad was a supervisor at an oil refinery. So like my socioeconomic background didn't necessarily correlate with who you think is going to prison. But I still found myself there nonetheless. I used to fight a lot, growing up. My class night award when I graduated from high school was the Revolutionist. So way back then, I was fighting about everything. And I think I just had a lot of like unresolved anger and issues around like the things I had experienced, and just the place where I was at 19. So I often tell people, it's not like your brain, the left side of your brain and the right side of your brain have this conversation. And it talks about, hey, we're going to show up in a non-violent or violent manner. We're going to be good today. It just expresses itself. And at that time, when I was arrested, I had just finished a year. I had a full scholarship to Xavier University in physics and engineering. And I was in the Navy.
You were in the Navy, physics and engineering.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
And then my crime was like to blow up a car dealership. So, that physics, engineering, science lab, that's kind of like where I live. And even present day, and I know we'll get into this. Once I was released from prison and I went back to college, my degree is in clinical laboratory science. So I still found my way back into the lab, so to say. So, yeah, but I mean, that was my crime. I was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, 20 years in state prison, and $1.9 million in restitution at 19. So,
10 years in federal, 20 years in state.
Mm-hmm. You ain't concurrent.
Okay.
And then $1.9 million in restitution, all for the same crime.
And did you serve both federal and state?
So my time was running concurrently. I actually made state parole while I was still incarcerated in the federal system. So when I was released, I was on supervised release for the federal system for 3 years. I was on parole for 11 years. And I paid restitution from the time I entered prison until I received, a pardon, which was about a 20-year span.
That's a lot.
A lot.
So you were in prison for 10 years. So now let's talk about dates, just so that people can anchor in. Mm-hmm. What year did you go to prison? What year did you come home?
2000. So I went to prison in February of 2000. I stayed in a few weeks. I got out for maybe a few days, and then I was back in March of 2000 for good. And then I went to the halfway house in January of 2009. And I was released from the halfway house in May of 2009.
Got it. Okay. And which prison facility were you at?
Well, I mean, almost everywhere because I got shipped a lot. I was in like 5 different places in 4 years, but I was in FCI, which is Federal Correctional Institute. I started in Carswell, Texas. Then I was sent to the federal prison camp in Coleman, Florida. I stayed there about 2 weeks. And then I was shipped to FCI Tallahassee, where I did approximately almost 5 years, my last 5 years of my sentence.
In Tallahassee? Okay, so I thought you were at Danbury.
2 years. I
For
was
2 years in
2 years.
Danbury. Got it. Okay, good. So one thing for sure is you've covered a lot of prison facilities in the federal system. And so hopefully there are a lot of women who can kind of, some of the stuff that you may share relate, although what we do know is prisons have changed a lot probably and remained the same since we both were in prison. So tell me about what it was like to be a 19-year-old facing 10 years. And that meant you were going to serve around 9 years?
Well, initially I was supposed to do like around 8 years and 2 months. But I don't know if everybody's aware, you didn't always get your 54 days off a year. So like when we were in prison, it was equaling out to about 47 days instead of the 54 days a year. The First Step Act kind of changed that legislation to make sure that people received the full 54 days a year. But I was supposed to do about 8 years and 2 months and then go to the halfway house for 6 months. But when I first went in, as I said, I was extremely young. I think I was the second youngest on the compound, and only by a few months. I used to fight a lot, that's why I got shipped everywhere. I used to fight a lot.
I was wondering about that part. I was like, why were you shipped so many times?
I used to fight a lot.
Okay, got it. And when people fight in prison, then they usually ship them to another facility.
Yeah, I did a lot of time in segregation, which is some solitary confinement. I did almost a year straight from the time that I was 21 to 22. So
you took a lot of anger with you.
And it wasn't really anger at people I was incarcerated with. It was more so, the correctional officers and how they speak to you and how they treat you. And I'm like, I don't care where I am. You're not.
Well, you had a long sentence too. And so sometimes I know for a lot of people who have a longer sentence, more than 5 years or 3 years, you can't see the end. And so, getting in trouble and an extra losing 5 days doesn't overly mean something.
No, but I went out with a bang. Every time I went in, I lost like 54 at one time. So I would lose a whole year worth of good time. Like I had to win one trip to segregation. But I think it also is like I came in, I had my high school diploma already. I had 1 year of college. So there really wasn't any programming or anything for me to get involved in. So it was just like a lot of idle time. I often, a lot of the work that I do now is really draped in the experiences that I had then. But I think about if I would have had an opportunity to go to college while I was incarcerated, I would have came home with like a PhD, and it would have been so different instead of me not being able to take any college classes until I got to Tallahassee, which was 5 years or 6 years into my sentence.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people don't realize is that for a lot of people who are in prison, and especially federal prison, there isn't a lot of programming. And so the thought of, while you're in prison, you can go to college, that it costs a lot of money and not all facilities allow you to be able to do that. So as a person who was smart sitting in prison, there wasn't a lot of programming. And in the federal facilities that you were in, were there any prison tablets?
No.
Email communication?
No.
Okay. So it was really the dark ages for you.
Only the telephone.
Got it. All right. So tell me what changed for you in prison. What was it that, was there a pivotal moment? Was there something that happened while you were there that made you get a little bit more settled or anchored in doing your time a little differently?
I mean, I think I grew up, I grew up in prison. So I think when I hit about 25, it was like, a light went off and it was like, hey, you absolutely cannot go back out into society the same way you came in. So it was like an internal decision for me to really start focusing on trying to do something different. I think a lot of times, there's this misconception that like prison reforms you or it changes you. And it's like really like a choice. It's a decision. You can let it engulf you and you can let it overtake you. And what happens to about 80% of the people that are there, they come out more harmed than they went in. And even though I feel like I came out more harmed than I went in, I also came out with like this like strong desire to like never go back there again. So like, when I was released, I was like, I had such PTSD is the best way I can explain it about going to prison. I'm like, something as small as a traffic stop can like become deadly or crazy because if the thought ever entered my mind that somebody physically was trying to bring me back to prison, I was like, they was just gonna have to kill me right then. I wasn't going.
Uh, your 9 years was enough. So now
Yeah.
talk to me about leaving prison. You left again in
2009.
you left in 2009. Do you remember the first thing you did when you left prison?
Yes, I stopped at McDonald's on the way home. And that was like an experience all of itself because McDonald's before I went to prison was definitely like not McDonald's when I got out of prison, but that's what I wanted to do. So Tallahassee is about 5.5 hours from New Orleans, where I was being released to. My sister actually was murdered a week before I got out. So we were trying to work with the Bureau of Prisons so that I could leave a day earlier for her funeral. So they didn't let me leave a day earlier. So I actually missed her funeral. But they did allow me extra time, like at home before having to report to the halfway house. So it was about a 5.5 hour drive. My friend who I met while I was incarcerated, she was in New Orleans. She rode up with my mom and my sister, and they picked me up and they drove me to my house where like my whole family was waiting for me to get out. So they cooked me like all kind of food, all the food that I wanted. They were like, Sarita, what do you want? So I had about 12 different things to eat. But I wanted
The best
to
food
stop.
that you had eaten in the last 9 years,
Oh,
right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I'm from the country, so we had everything, wildlife, all of the things. I wanted everything, so yeah.
Wonderful.
And my whole family was there, so it was good.
Yeah. So talk to me. I know the work that you currently do. And so you do a lot of work supporting women who are in prison. So talk to me about the work you're doing and why you're doing it.
So I started Operation Restoration in 2016, around the time that you and I met, and it was out of a direct like understanding that I could start an organization that supported women and girls impacted by incarceration. Prior to that, like Louisiana has this history of incarceration. We incarcerate the most people per capita than anywhere in the world. And there were not any programs, very few programs for people who had been to prison in general when I was released. But women, there were none. So I always like gave back to people I was incarcerated with in like a small way by sending like clothes or a phone or something of the sort. But it wasn't until, around the time we met in the national organization that we were both working with at the time, showed me through our travels that there's actually a way in which you can formalize this and do it in a concerted way, that I was actually able to see that people around the country actually were starting organizations and had businesses that focused on people who were being released from prison. But that just was not an area that I had ever saw. I often joke and tell people that the only acquaintance I had with the nonprofit was the church. And, the church is always asking for money. They pass in a collection plate. They build the church off of the congregation. So I didn't even know, Tulane University was a nonprofit, or the hospitals in the community were also nonprofits, and that you could build a successful business that didn't depend on the people that you served. So that was eye-opening for me. So when I started the organization, it was really driven out of creating access to the things that I wish I had access to while I was incarcerated and after
So it
incarceration.
was based on a void you saw and also
Avoid that
thinking of your,
experience.
yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
thinking about yourself and what you needed. And from there, you started. So talk about what does Operation Hope,
Operation Restoration.
Operation Restoration offer?
So Operation Restoration offers, we have 15 programs that we run. We initially started off focusing on direct services and education. When I was released, I remember, somebody sending me to Dress for Success. And I remember going into Dress for Success and they're saying, hey, pick out, a business suit and some shoes. And there really wasn't any support about like fashion, what type of clothing to pick out. It was just like, here, I didn't even know what size I wore. But I picked out some things. And I remember going back to the halfway house. And I remember saying, I don't even have like a shell to put underneath this suit. And am I supposed to wear a slip or should I have on stockings? And like the expectation can't be that I sleep in a suit, I didn't know my bra size, it's just all of those things. So when I created Operation Restoration, the first thing we did was we opened up a closet and we had like a closet attendant who was there to help people know what current fashion scents are. It was set up like a boutique where you could go shopping and you can try on clothing, but it wasn't just like business attire. It was everything from like lounging clothes to pajamas to underclothes.
So you almost became like a concierge. And one thing I do know is that a lot of the women who birthed organizations during the time that you did, it was providing white glove service and just really humanizing for women the experience of being a woman.
Yeah, and
Again.
and also being like, if you take it a step further, even just being a human being, right? I remember like every place I went, I felt like I was having like these emotional outbursts because I had to explain why I didn't know a thing. I had to explain why I didn't know my bra size. And I would, I tell people I was in Victoria's Secret and I had like a total meltdown. And a lady was like, what size bra do you? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, what do you mean? You don't know like what cup size? I was like, don't y'all have measuring tapes or something? Can't you like support me through this? And she was like, I just don't understand. I was like, I remember yelling. I was like, I've been in prison for 10 years and I wore sports bras, small, medium, and large. Do you know what that equates to in a cup? And with?
I'm sure that was an eye-opening for her and you both.
Yeah, but I mean, it was the same.
But hopefully for her, it also was an opportunity for her to realize, wait a minute, not everybody who walks in here. And I can relate to that because one day we'll have a whole underwear story conversation, right? Because trust me, being away from my underclothes, when I saw them again, I was like, that's what I thought about myself back then.
Well, I think for me being 19 and being like not developed or like fully a woman, before I went in, I might have been like an A and a half. By the time I come out, I'm 29 and things are different, And it's just like not even having the concept of like all of the things you would struggle with or prior to me going in, the internet didn't exist.
Right.
When I got out, everything is online. So I remember sitting in front of a computer to apply for a job because you go to the services that are there to support you. They put you in front of a computer and the computer wasn't on and I'm just sitting there and I remember the woman walking over and she's like, you have to turn the computer off. And I remember me snapping on her and be like, listen, this is my first time seeing this. Where is the power button? So everything was
so you needed a transition center.
Correct.
And so do you consider the work that you're doing kind of more of that transition so that you're able to take a woman from prison and help them softly integrate back into society?
Yeah, I think that's totally like how we ended up at 15 programs, right? Because at first it was just education and direct services. Now we deal with housing, we deal with just such a multitude of things, policy and advocacy work. We deal with rapid response support, just like all of the things you need in order to remove the barriers. But the great thing is that in the state of Louisiana, we are able to go into the women's prison 18 months prior to release and actually work with every woman who's being ready to get released. And I think that like, while I would want to start working with somebody on day one in prison because I feel like reentry starts the first day of your incarceration. going in 18 months is really helpful.
Got it. All right. So I know for you, education was important. It was important for you to finish the education you started. And I do recall years ago, you were someone who said you wanted to, I think, be a medical doctor as well. So talk to me a little bit about the education that you've started and completed since coming home.
Yeah, so I was able to take college courses while I was in Tallahassee. Tallahassee Community College used to come into the prison, and I was in a unique space where my parents could pay for me to go to school while I was incarcerated. So I took about 30 hours there. I had a 3.87 or something like that GPA when I got out, and I just knew that in order for me to re-enter successfully at that time, I thought that I had to get my education. So I applied to school while I was in the halfway house, and I was denied entrance into the University of New Orleans. And for me, it was like such a blow because I had no concept that my criminal conviction would stop me from getting my education. And it kind of like set me back because I was like, man, what am I going to do now that I can't go to school?
Because education was what you were thinking was going to be what helped to keep you out of prison.
And it was also something I was good at. So it was easy for me to like go to school and learn. I love learning. I was good at school, always have been. So that was kind of like something that I knew I could do, accomplish, and begin to like remove myself, from my past. But when I got out and I was unable to go, I started working jobs and, just all of the things. And then about 2 years later, I was married and I was pregnant with my son. And then I started seeing all the statistics about like parents who are in prison or went to prison, the likelihood of their children going to prison. And my son's father and myself both were formerly incarcerated. So I was like, I want to go back to school. And he was like, you should go back to school. And I was like, yeah, but I tried that. So I decided to apply to the same school. I used the same electronic application because by this time I'm good, with the internet. I know a little bit more than I did when I first got out. So I used the same application, and the only change I made was I unchecked the box, which the box is the question around your criminal history and your convictions. So instead of checking yes, I have been convicted of a felony, I checked no. And I submitted the application. That was the only change I made. And I was accepted into the University of New Orleans.
I'm holding my breath over here for the record. I don't know if that's good advice, but matter of fact, I know it's not good advice. But anyway,
well, I mean, we've changed the laws, but the bad advice should be that you should not be locked out of all your constitutional rights as a byproduct of committing a crime, right?
And you were instrumental in changing that particular law on application so that people today do not have to check that box.
Correct.
I always got to correct it. For everybody else.
So going through that process of like being accepted within 24 hours in the same way I was denied in 24 hours just really showed me that there were so many barriers to people trying to re-enter. And there were barriers that shouldn't even be there in the first place, right? So went to school, ended up talking to my professor and letting him know that I had changed the box. He's like, oh, don't worry about it. He was like, I'm going to help you work through that. And it was because he felt like I was different than his picture of like who was incarcerated.
Because he had a human one-on-one experience with you, he was willing to kind of
work with me to make sure that I continued my education. So I was on the right path. I ended up going to LSU Health and Science Center, getting my degree in clinical laboratory science. But I wanted to go to med school. But like at every step of my journey, even though I answered the initial questions to get into undergrad, when I went into my specialty program, I had to answer the questions again. And then when I applied to med school and took the MCAT, I had to answer the questions again. So by this time, I'm like, something else, has to change. We got to do something different.
And that's when you went the legislative route.
Yep. We filed the ban the box legislation in Louisiana on college applications for purposes of admission in 2017. We passed the legislation in Louisiana, making Louisiana the first state to do so. And since then, we've been able to pass it in 8 additional states. We work with advocates on the ground, give them like bill language. We support them through the legislative process. And we've been able to, change it on the state level. We also have been able to work on Pell reinstatement on a federal level where people who are incarcerated are able to receive Pell funding. We worked to remove the question off of the Common App. So the question around criminal history is no longer on the Common App. And then we also worked on FAFSA simplification. And this all came out of the Unlock Higher Ed Coalition that we started just to really challenge access to higher education for currently and formerly incarcerated students.
Good. Tell me, what is the highest level of education you've accomplished? Because I know you talked about all the
So I have
blocks that you have.
Yeah, I have my bachelor's of science and clinical laboratory science, and then I'm nationally certified and licensed in the state of Louisiana as a medical technologist.
And then you did all this amazing legislation. But I also know you ran for political office.
I did.
Yeah.
So my sweatshirt, it says vote. Y'all can't see the back, but it says politics is personal. I ran for U.S. Senate in Louisiana in 2022 against John Kennedy, our current senator. It was my first time running for office. Louisiana has...
Pretty ambitious.
Yeah, why not? Louisiana has jungle politics where everybody runs against everybody. It's no primary, so no Democratic primary, Republican primary. Everybody runs. There were 13 people in the race. I finished fourth. I was the only woman in the race.
Wonderful.
And then I also got a dual endorsement from the Democratic Party in the state of Louisiana just based on a lot of the work and just different things. I got a vote in Louisiana we have parishes instead of counties. I got a vote in every single parish and did really well for my first time.
Absolutely. Number 4 out of 13 and against that particular senator. That's remarkable. And then you received a presidential pardon.
I did.
From President Trump in his first term.
It's the last day in office, 12 hours before he got out of office.
How did that feel?
So I had just had my daughter. I was asleep when I got the call at midnight. I just went to sleep. And I remember getting a phone call, and I was like, when you're sleeping, you're tired, and you're sleep deprived, you probably say some crazy things. But I remember getting a call and him saying, "Hey, Sarita, I just want to let you know that you received the presidential pardon." I was like, what does it say? Jessica Jackson called me on the phone, and I had worked with Jessica and Van at Cut 50 for a while as a policy consultant, and she probably was the best person who could call me and give me that news. And she dutifully began to read the pardon to me. And I think about it now and I laugh, but what I was looking for was the remission included inside of the pardon.
So you had your policy hat on.
Yes.
In that moment.
In my sleep. But I didn't
while you were getting a pardon and you were listening for, what does this include?
Yes.
And what does it omit?
Yes, because not only did I need the pardon from the crime, but I needed release from the financial responsibility.
From the $1.9 million
in restitution, which that part of your pardon is called remission. So I was trying to make sure that the remission was included.
Was it?
Absolutely. Then I really got happy.
Well, good for you. And that's interesting because it was included, but you're working on remission for others.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So so how you today are paying it forward is anything that was important or anything that was a stumbling block or a roadblock for you today, with that lived experience, with that knowledge, you're trying to remove those roadblocks for others.
Yeah, and also the things I became aware of on my way. And as I began to do this work, so housing wasn't an issue for me. I was able to go to my parents' home. I was home maybe 4 or 5 months. I had started working. I was able to get my apartment. housing insecurity wasn't necessarily an issue for me, but so many people that I meet, that's an issue. That's one of the things that we focus on at the organization. I didn't have children when I went to prison. I was a child myself. So family reunification is another big issue that we work on, because in the state of Louisiana, your parental rights can be terminated at 18 months. Subjectively. So a lot of women that we work with, we really try to make sure that they still have some type of connection to their children, their family. We support and bring in visits up to the prison. So there are things that, like, not even that just affected me, but affect the people that I care about, the people I was incarcerated with. And those very much like guide the 15 programs that we have at Operation Restoration.
Got it. One, I know we could go forever. I have maybe two more questions for you. And what I know is, I always say that there's this national problem called mass incarceration, but reentry is hyperlocal. So for people who are returning back home, and especially into New Orleans, where can they go? What should they be thinking about when it comes to looking for housing, if housing is going to be an issue for them?
So housing is really like a national, crisis. We have worked really closely with BJA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, really working on the HUD guidelines and the federal definition of homelessness, because being incarcerated does not count as being homeless. So most people, when they're released from prison, whether it's a local prison, federal prison, state jails, wherever they're coming from, they are counted on the census inside of the prison. So it's deemed that they therefore have housing. So they actually have to come out of prison and physically be unhoused in order to start qualifying for homeless services. And this is like, a national issue. We have really been working on changing that federal definition of homelessness. That's been like the biggest
But
push.
the person who's sitting in prison, who's not focused on policy, they're focused on, where am I going to lay my head safely? Where would you tell them to go, or where is their starting point? Because you're like a policy wonk. I'm listening to you. You can just go through the policy.
So what I know to be true is that people don't know how to find their own resources if they don't understand the problem. So the problem is, you can't show up at any agency that supports homeless individuals or unhoused individuals and say that I'm homeless if you are not in the system as a homeless person. And being released from prison does not qualify you for that. So actually, when a person is released from prison, the only place that they can really qualify to go is a shelter, because that is how they get into the homeless system. So they have to find an agency that writes homeless letters or adds them into the homeless system. So a shelter, a transitional home, a halfway house, those agencies that work with state and local government officials to classify a person as homeless. In New Orleans specifically, what we find is that women who do not have custody of their children are at the highest risk of being unhoused, because the only shelters that we have is a co-ed shelter or women and children shelter. So women who do not have custody or ownership, immediate conservatorship over their children, have the hardest time finding somewhere to stay, because the systems in most localities are not set up for single women. So those are the people that you see sleeping outside and underneath bridges. But I think the first concept, the conceptual fact that people have to understand is, what does homelessness mean where you are?
So understanding that, and what you're saying is, start at a shelter.
Or your Salvation Armies or United Ways, or places that house individuals that can then add you into the system as being homeless.
Yeah. That's good. It's good when you said United Way and Salvation Army, because those are brands and names that people know of. And it's a good starting point. And at a minimum, they should be able to help you know where to go in your area.
Yes.
All right, 2 questions. I'm going to give you them both. What's next for you? And actually, what's next for you?
So I am still the president, CEO of Operation Restoration. So still working there, expanding programs. I have about 30 people that work with me on a daily basis. But I've also started a consulting practice, our firm, in 2018, which really focuses on helping people build out the business infrastructure of their programs, their for-profit or nonprofit entities. I think that a lot of times people have great ideas, great concepts. Either they can't execute it or they're not aware of the business infrastructure that's needed in order to become successful. And a lot of people who are formerly incarcerated have to lean on entrepreneurship. So being in that space of helping people build the infrastructure for their nonprofit, their for-profit, consulting businesses, whatever it is that they see fit for themselves, making sure that they have the right infrastructure in place is extremely important. My consulting practice was actually selected as one of the diversity supplier businesses for the Super Bowl will be in New Orleans. So really expand into a different audience, but being able to still focus on, minority-led initiatives is very, very important to me. I think women deserve to be heard, highlighted, and supported in ways that have not necessarily happened, in this country. So I think that's probably, where I'm headed, what's next. And then also we've really been doing a lot of work in the environmental space currently, because I don't know if people know, but prisons are like the number one polluters in the country outside of, all refineries and industry. So really thinking
I didn't
about
know that. So you gave me new information.
Really thinking about making sure that we're focusing on that as well is extremely important.
All right. And then last, if you don't mind, is if you can just offer a word of encouragement. When I think of you going to prison at 19, I went at 44. Big difference. And just, talk to someone who's sitting in prison, maybe sitting on their bunk, have taken trauma, some anger, some frustration into prison, and, they don't see the end. What hope would you offer, for them, but speak directly to them?
Yeah, I think that it's really like three things that I can give you. The first would be is that you have to give yourself grace. You didn't get where you were overnight, and upon your release, your transition is not going to happen overnight. So give yourself grace and space to really reacclimate yourself and understand your actual needs and who you are outside of prison. The second thing is, and I tell this to anybody, people in prison are some of the most creative, imaginative, most intelligent people I've ever met in my entire life. And I want to give you, do not let the lack of imagination that people you come into contact with kill your creativity, kill your dreams, and kill the vision that you have for yourself. And lastly, it's not going to be easy. It's going to take hard work, dedication, and being solely dedicated to your life outside of prison. For me, if you take those three things, you can do whatever you want. You can become whatever you want. And the world is yours. So as long as you keep those three things in front of you, and, for me, I'm very spiritually grounded. So, I pray. So whatever it is that you do, whether you pray, you meditate, you do yoga, make sure you find time for those things in your daily routine to take the edge off, because being released is like just being dropped into an alternate universe. So just make sure you're giving yourself space and grace. That would have to be what I would say.
And if anyone wanted to find you, because I hope more women are coming home to New Orleans, just because I know you got good programming down there, where can they find you?
Well, yeah, we support people nationally too. So we've supported people being released to other countries, other states. Of course, the services are not as in depth, but the organization is Operation Restoration. We are on all social medias, so Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn.
What's your web address?
It's www.or-nola.org. And if you leave a message there, we will contact you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Really appreciate it. Our goal is for people to come home ready, but not only come home, stay home.